Hello, beautiful people who are here on the first official episode of Love, Sex, and Pleasure with your host, Ann Nguyen. And wow, I can't believe we're here. I'm starting this podcast. I've been thinking about starting this podcast for years, and I've got my ass really sat here and doing it. So, thank you for being here. In today's episode, I am really here just to share more about me, about why I'm starting this podcast, to share my story with you all around my own healing, around sex, love, intimacy, and my relationship with myself so that you can get to know who is this person that you are choosing to spend time with and to learn with. And so, where I really want to start, first and foremost, is my description of who I am is who I am today, Friday, February 9th, 11:15 a.m. Pacific time, because we are ever changing beings. And I think the first thing that I'm called to say is that the first thing you should know about me is I am a human. I am a human who has ideas, who has always sensed inside of me that there is something powerful, something creative, something even worth sharing with the world, and who has been on a journey, maybe a really conscious journey of it, for 10 years to find my voice, to find the courage to be sat here in front of this mic, sharing my ideas and deciding to take up space in the world with my desires, with my visions, and with my interests. And so, this is first and foremost how I would invite you all always to relate to me, as well as the vibe of how I want this to feel. Of course, I am a coach, I am a teacher, I am a professional, a practitioner. Those are parts of myself that I take very seriously. But first and foremost, I'm a human who is walking alongside this journey with you. And that is the primary orientation of how I want these conversations to feel. Honestly, when I've talked about how I want this podcast to feel, it's been like you're sitting on the couch, drinking a coffee, kind of lounging around with your bestie. And of course, we just get into like deep and beautiful conversations. So, that is the vibe that you will get here. And I wanted to start off this journey with you all with sharing my story of how I got here, what has formed a lot of my ideas. I see in all of us our life journeys as being the primary sacred text of our lives, the primary place from which we gather our perspectives. And of course, with any teacher or coach or person that you follow that's out there, our lives are always our primary source material. And so, me sharing the story, it's I'm already feeling a little nervous. It feels tender, it feels vulnerable, and I'm just naming all of these things again to be a human. But also, I'm sharing this because I know that stories to me, especially amongst sort of the feminine way of sharing and teaching one another, are just ways that we get to see little aspects and snippets of ourselves within other humans. I think it's one of the things that just most innately connects us to one another. And I know I've been so grateful for so many of my teachers, so many books I've read, so many pieces of art I've consumed where there is this raw and honest telling of their stories that has built this connection and built this feeling of being understood and being seen. And so, although, of course, my story may not be exactly the same as yours, I'm certain 100% that it won't be. I share this in the spirit of you getting to know me and hopefully getting to know yourself, to see yourself, to feel seen or validated or belonging maybe in some of the things that you have gone through. So here we go. Let's get into it. My healing journey, my spiritual pleasure, sexual, maybe not the sexual journey, but definitely my healing journey really began, I would say, when I was about 7 years old. And I was someone who experienced a lot of trauma and chaos in my childhood. I am the daughter of Vietnamese refugees. My parents actually met because my dad was, his job was, I guess you would call it kind of like the Underground Railroad equivalent of escaping Vietnam. His job was to help people escape, help boat people escape from Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And the boat that my mom found herself on during her escape was the one that he was driving, I guess. I don't know what the word is for a boat, but it was his last sail out, the one where he had sent off other people and now he was going as a refugee as well. So that is how my parents met. And I grew up in a household where, I mean, eventually, of course, they came to America, they made me. In my childhood home, I experienced a lot of violence. My father was an alcoholic, he was a gambling addict, and he was extremely physically abusive towards my mom. And so in my childhood, I remember feeling intense feelings of trauma inside of my body that were unexplainable. Because, of course, as a kid, you go through these things. And in my culture, just the family that I happened to be born in, the source of that trauma was never addressed and never talked about. And so I was honestly quite a dark child. I already had a lot of heaviness in me as I was growing up. I also had great imprints. I grew up with family. I had people who loved me. And so, just like all of us, I think our childhoods can be very complex. But I think it's important to just address the full story of both where I come from and both where we come from as just tools for us to better understand ourselves. And I really name 7 years old being the beginning of my healing journey because at that point, my mom had divorced my dad. I grew up with her, well, kind of more in my teenage and adulthood, really relaying the story as like my birth is what saved her. Becoming a mother and having me in her arms was the thing that made her really leave and finally decide, like, I really can't be in this anymore. And when I was 7, at that point, I experienced a lot of rage. I had intense outbursts. I just had a lot of trauma, to the point where the neighbors around us, around me and my mom, probably heard me, saw me. This innocent, probably really cute little 7-year-old who I think there was just no hiding that there was both like a really big light, but a really big darkness in me. And one of my neighbors was a teacher at our local Christian Sunday school. And so she offered my mom so beautifully. Honestly, we've lost contact with this woman. If I could find her again one day and thank her, I really would. But she volunteered to take me to Sunday school with her on Sundays because she thought that it could be something that was good for me. Luckily, I escaped any clause of like really intense church dogma. It wasn't a church that was really trying to like super convert me. But what I did gain through that was prayer. So through starting to go to this Sunday school, I began to pray every single night. And I'd say it's the beginning of my healing journey because it was the beginning of me as a child feeling all of those intense feelings and doing something about it, feeling like there was something that I could do about it. My orientation and my teaching is also deeply rooted in a connection between spirituality and our pleasure and our bodies and our empowerment. And so, also, why this is an important part of the story to tell. But I began to pray every single night. I prayed for my mom. I prayed for my friends. I prayed for my family who, were immigrants and were going through chaos and all of that in many different ways. And in many ways, it was just the beginning of my spiritual journey. It was the beginning of a relationship to possibility, to healing, to a force and a belief of something that is larger or has been larger than myself. And just to go into other territories here, as a kid, I would say I was always curious. I was always learning. I was always wanting to sing. I've always been innately into art. I'm a Libra rising, a Virgo sun, a Capricorn moon, September 10th, 1989. If any of you are astrologers who want to do my chart or give me unsolicited astrology insights, I am officially soliciting those. But anyways, I was always curious, and I have also always been a lover. I remember having my first crush when I was in kindergarten. I kind of remember that feeling of like, ooh, attraction. Ever since I was a kid, I was always curious about love. I was deeply curious about boys. I always had crushes. And so, yeah, I think what I'm really just trying to say here is that I'm acknowledging that I have been interested in love. I've been interested in a relationship. I have had this yearning to connect and to love and to merge and to experience other people since a very young age, as I'm sure a lot of you did too. Maybe not, but that a lot of us did. Um, I was also quite a rebel as I was growing up. So now I'm kind of talking about me through elementary school and middle school. But I questioned everything. My biggest question was always, but why? I always needed to know the reasoning behind things. And I think that this really contributes to my strength as a teacher and also is something that just keeps on fostering my curiosity today. And I think that this quality of questioning, of figuring things out, of interrogating why are things the way that they are, that we kind of allow children to have, is something that we should all be carrying throughout our whole lives and into our adulthood. Um, so I question everything. I was a little bit of a rebel for that reason. I would often find myself in the principal's office. I remember questioning, even at a young age, dress codes in middle school. Like, why are you telling girls that they can't wear short shorts, but nothing is being done about the boys? I just always needed things to make sense. I think my Libra rising, or just my personality, was always also turned towards justice. I always felt really deeply things that didn't feel just or equal or right. And I always felt a need to speak up for those things. So I also had a natural bent towards leadership. I think I ran for like class council, maybe president of like the second grade, which is something that I honestly haven't acknowledged or celebrated in myself until adulthood, looking back at it. Um, but yes, so especially, of course, through middle school, I just crushed hard. I just remember so much of my middle school being about crushing on boys and talking about it incessantly with my friends. And I also did experience a nice and short, innocent relationship with my sexuality. and self pleasure. I would say maybe between like the sixth to eighth grade. My mom, being Vietnamese, was very, she did not talk about sex at home. It was something that she like really left to the school. And our school it didn't teach, just abstinence, but it really was more of that, Mean Girls, where like, if you have sex, you will get diseases and get pregnant and die. Like it was it was that type of sex education, but they did talk about this thing called self-pleasure. And so I remember having my first orgasm in the bath by myself, maybe in the sixth or seventh grade, because at school they had been talking about this thing called masturbation. And I was like, I wonder what this is all about. And so it was just when I reflect on my sexual growth and journey, it was really this like beautiful, kind of like untouched period of innocence, of like pleasure between just me and my own body. It was never something that I talked to my friends about. It was never something that I talked to my parents about. But it was like this sort of discovery of like, oh, there is this like good feeling that I could have. And it just felt very protected in that way. Of course, at the same time, I had all of the normal insecurities of going through puberty and being a young teen, of not being good enough, wanting to be chosen by my crushes, all the patriarchal conditioning that comes, being, identifying as a cis woman, a lot of patriarchal conditioning just around how I should be and how I should look, and, growing up in that fun way that I'm sure a lot of us did. But as I reflect also on my sexuality and my influences, I also had the influence of muses, of powerful women, particularly hip hop artists like Lil Kim, who had this expression of owning and this bravado and sort of like outrightness about their sexuality. Hip hop culture is definitely something that I have been deeply immersed in and passionate about since I was a kid. And I think that there's just this huge way where when I was growing up, while we were, women were shamed for their sexuality and there were so many things, there was also this little outlet of like kind of free, outright in your face sexual expression, that I really grew up with. And then, of course, high school came along and everything intensified. And I had my first relationship. And here is when, so fun, I repeated a lot of my childhood imprints and patterns, which a lot of us do in relationship. Our primary caregivers and what we saw growing up absolutely influence so much of the ways that we come into relationship. It doesn't always, it shows up differently for everybody. But for me, a lot of my life has been literally repeating the patterns that I saw in my childhood. So, no surprises here. It was an extremely abusive and dysfunctional and emotionally, spiritual, mentally, at times physically abusive relationship. And I think this is also something that we don't talk about often, is how so many teenagers and so many of us coming of age can have relationships that leave deep imprints like this. And so in that relationship, I experienced things that I would definitely equate to sexual trauma. And those are layers that I have carried with me, had to work through in my journey, and then probably some of my layers still do. Um, I was in that relationship from my junior year in high school until the end of my freshman, actually the beginning of my sophomore year in college. So it was a very long time and during a very important developmental period for me. Um, after leaving that relationship, finally, after a lot of drama, a lot of trauma. I was in college, and the college that I went to is a really big party school. And, it was really just during the era of kind of partying and drinking a lot, and this culture that was present of casual sex, situationships, all of that. And so I explored that, even though it never really felt right for me. Casual sex never really felt right for me. But again, I just felt like it was what I was supposed to do. And I think that a lot of us can probably relate to that. Growing up and doing things in sex, doing things in our exploration that really just feel like things that we were quote unquote supposed to do. In college, I also entered into another, I would say, long-term situationship, that was pretty traumatic. It included STIs, it included abortions, and just chasing people who were absolutely unavailable. And I think that this really started to ingrain in me like this identity, or I think just ever since I was a kid, there was just very much this association with love and pain, love and torture, love and it not working out, love and, me losing myself in many ways. And that was actually extremely impactful for me, so much so that I think by the time I graduated, maybe when I was 21 or 22, I had a year of celibacy. My body, I think my emotional, my everything just like had enough. And I had a year of celibacy. But then, of course, I couldn't stay away for too long. And in my early 20s, I entered into another long term relationship. And while that relationship was not abusive, I think it was truly one of like my first true loves, which is so beautiful. But it was still unhealthy. I had intense anxious attachment. I obviously had a lot of trauma and was operating from having no view of what healthy love could be. And my partner was also young, and although I know that he really loved me, had all of his own stuff. And so, but what was beautiful about that relationship was that within that relationship, I think that there was enough love and enough health where I could start to finally begin to explore, or the question finally started coming up for me of, because before this, so let me backtrack a little bit. So before this, through high school, through college, even in this relationship in my early 20s, I think my primary orientation around sex was, this is the way that I get guys to like me. This is the way that I earn love. It's something I have to do, it's something that I have to perform. It really became something, that completely was opposite to that very short, innocent period in middle school where it was like my sexuality belonged to everyone but myself. And that is one of my favorite quotes from one of my teachers, Layla Martin. She has said before, women's sexuality is one of the most powerful forces on earth for everyone except for the woman herself. And I would say that by the time I was in my mid 20s, this is really the territory that I was in. But during this time, I had enough capacity and enough safety and love in my relationship where, although a lot of sex I did to try to keep the relationship alive, I also started to begin to explore like, there are other people who enjoy sex not just because it gives them validation, not just because it gives them connection, not just because it's keeping their relationship alive or makes them feel wanted, but because there's actually pleasure there, like physical pleasure there. And up until that point, if I'm really honest, I'm being really honest, there was no pleasure in sex for me. I didn't like penetration. It hurt. And just like I reflected, most of the pleasure that I got from sex was actually through like the highs of validation and the highs of connection. And so as I always have done my whole life, when I get curious about something, I research. I am such a researcher. I'm a deep forever learner. That is another really big part of me. And I began to just look high and low. I looked on Tumblr accounts. I looked on like seedy, weird porn sites. Like this was like before, this is like early internet times. And so it was still very hard to find things about empowering sex education, but I looked high and low for how can I start feeling pleasure in my own body. I became really fixated specifically on G spot orgasms. For some reason, I told myself if I could finally have G spot orgasms, if I could orgasm from penetration with a partner, somehow I would be like sexually fixed and sexually whole. And during that time, it was a lot of still focus on like if I could find the right technique, right? And I think that that's a lot of also how many of us feel like a sexual journey should go. If I could find the right toy, if I could find the right position, if I could find the right XYZ, the right lingerie, that might fix my sexual problems. But of course, that didn't. And I eventually ended up leaving that relationship. And during that time, so like in parallel, I began to hear about this thing called coaching. And I heard about it on blogs on the internet. These people who were helping other people through being a coach and making money from it and running businesses and having this career doing this. And I was very intrigued because I've always been that sort of wise sage, the person who my friends went to for advice. And so in my 20s, in my early 20s, I was very much in this deep question of like, what's my career gonna be? Who am I? All of those really fun questions that you have in your 20s. And I heard about this thing. And so I signed up for a coach training. And I had never gone to therapy. I guess I'd never done really intentional like self development or counseling or anything like that. And so I ended up doing a coach training, but really to me, that coach training was just an introduction to what is coaching therapy, working with, a mental health professional. What is that? And so, or around the time that I was leaving that relationship, around the time that this question around my pleasure was growing, I also was introduced to my first coach, teacher, mentor. Her name is Rachel Maddox. She's also now today one of my dearest friends. And I began my first deep and long-term coaching relationship where I finally knew about what trauma even was. Rachel was one of the first people that I knew who was doing kind of like somatic trauma work. I would say this is even in like the beginning of trauma really coming to the forefront of a lot of people's awareness. This is probably like a decade ago now. And I remember beginning to work with her and I came to her in the throes of the beginning of the end of my relationship. And I remember kind of telling her about my background. And she was the first person who ever told me, like, oh, like you have trauma. Trauma is this thing that lives in your body. She broke the whole thing down to me. And I remember her telling me that it was probably connected to my childhood, probably connected to my dad. And I remember saying to her like, "Oh, no, I'm just having trouble with my relationships. Like this has nothing to do with my dad." And I remember her just laughing at me and as a good coach does, being like, "Okay, like we'll cross that bridge when we're ready." So it was really just like the beginning of my reckoning with healing in general. But in that container, I would say it was one of the most powerful and transformative times in my life because as I left that relationship, now, I probably started dating or being in relationships when I was like 15. At that point, I was probably 25. So a decade of strings of really hard relationships, I finally decided to say, I'm ready to look into the mirror. I'm ready to look at the root of where all of this comes from. I'm ready to take radical responsibility for my own healing. And I remember leaving that relationship and like devoting to myself, like, I'm going to heal from this. It was so excruciating. It was so painful to be living the way that I was living, that it was really one of those, like, I'm on my knees moment. Like, I will do anything. I will do anything for this pain to go away. I will do anything to not live the rest of my life this way, because at that point, that's what I thought that I was doomed for the rest of my life. I truly felt that love was painful. I thought I was sexually broken. I thought that there was just something wrong with me. There was this thing that so many other people had figured out that it felt impossible for me to figure out. But I was devoted. And so a lot of things happened, a lot of explorations, but the biggest thing is that I did somatic trauma resolution, meaning working with the traumatic imprints through my body to heal. And I worked with Rachel for years. And so during that time, I discovered so many things. I discovered trauma resolution. I committed to healing. I decided that I was going to heal my relationship with men, and that I was going to believe that there was possibility that there were good men out there. As my pleasure exploration also continued, I also began to find my teacher, one of my first teachers around sexuality and Tantra, Layla Martin. I remember finding a YouTube video from her, and for the first time, I heard someone talking about sex, not just as a technique, not just as something physical, but an actual spiritual, emotional process, a way of relating to yourself, a self-love journey that you could go on. And I just remember all of the lights started to come on in my body. And I was like, yes, like this is the thing that I have been looking for my whole life. And because I was searching, and because I think I made myself available, and I think this happens so much for so many of us when we're searching and we're finally making ourselves available for answers, the answers started coming. I also picked up a book called Pussy by Mama Gina, Regina Thomas Hauer. And that book really opened my eyes to the path of pleasure, the path of reclaiming pleasure and pussy and our bodies and our sexuality as a way to love ourselves, but also as a place of expansion and self-expression. And so I just really started on my own pleasure journey. I remember at that point, because my relationship, I had really like lost myself. Every relationship I went into, I just like completely abandoned myself and did anything that I could for love. I was quite literally, I felt gray. Like I was pale, I remember. Um I like wouldn't get my hair cut even though I had enough money to get haircuts. Like I felt like an empty shell of a human being. And I remember this path of pleasure thing. One of the first things that I did was I bought myself a red silk robe, and there's a selfie on one of my Instagrams that I remember that I took, because it was the first time I bought something that felt sexy, that felt pleasurable, that felt empowering just for me. And that was so revolutionary for me. And I started to go on this journey of exploring, what is my sexuality like? What is my pleasure like for me? And it was the first time, I will share with you my very first personal sexual empowerment practice. Rachel gave me this one during our work together. I was to light a candle and put lotion on my own body, like slowly, with presence and with love. And I remember the first few times that I did this, I wept. Like I literally cried, because there was so much grief, and there was so much like, wow, like I am probably at this point like 26 years old, and I have never touched my own body like this. I have never loved or cherished myself or my body or my pleasure like this. And it was just this opening of this incredibly beautiful portal. And then after that, Layla Martin, the person whose YouTube videos I'd found, I started doing some of the practices that she gave for free. And I found out that she was doing a coach training. And so, me being someone who loves to dive all the way in, I decided to go for her coach training. And at this point, I had been working in tech at Google and YouTube. And I was living in San Francisco. I was living the single life. I was partying a lot. And I was going through my Saturn return. So at this point, I was, I think, 27 going on 28. And I remember I was on a cruise with my friend. She was napping. She's one of my best friends. She's like my sister. She was napping. I was laying there and I was in that sort of like, what the hell am I doing with my life? Saturn return vibe. And I remember, y'all, this is like the only time, maybe not the only time, but there was like a booming voice that literally felt like the voice of God that was like, you need to move home. You need to move home because if you stay in San Francisco in this like just going out every weekend, weekend warrior, working, partying every weekend, being hungover, like you're gonna be stuck here. And I remember I was so terrified, but I listened to that voice and just within like a month, I decided I'm leaving San Francisco. I'm moving back home with my mom. I'm doing this coach training and I think I'm going to become a love, sex, and pleasure coach. So that's what I did. I left my sort of like shiny Sex and the City life in San Francisco and I moved back home into my mom's house. And I started doing the most intense, so because the way that the course works, you do all the work on yourself in a very intense way. It was like 5 pleasure practices and 5 meditations a week. And so I was working full time while I was doing it. So essentially, I was living at home with my mom. Every single morning I would wake up. She had already gone to work. I would do intense pleasure practices, tantric practices, and meditations for like an hour. Before then, I went to my corporate job, and then I would do even more training, even more learning, and all of that. But the biggest thing that happened was, I mean, everything. I went through the biggest sexual awakening of my life. I went through so much healing. I fell madly, deeply in love with my own body. I experienced a Kundalini awakening, an awakening of my energy. I fell in love with Tantra and the Tantric path. There were other things that happened in my spirituality. We'll put that in another podcast episode. But just because I had been exploring spirituality, throughout all of this stuff that was happening. And yeah, it just changed my life in the most beautiful, intense, and profound ways. And by the time that I left that training, I was just ready to sing this from the rooftops. I was ready to just share with the world, anyone who would listen to me, anyone who will listen to me, that healing your life through pleasure is possible, that our bodies are sacred, that self-pleasure can be a way of healing trauma and falling in love with yourself, that pleasure could be a way to just take up space and heal in the world. And so I was very bright-eyed, and that was the beginning of my coaching journey. Simultaneously, of course, like at the exact same time that I decided to make this big change in my life, I started to date my current partner. There are a lot of dating trials and tribulations, again, that I'll put in a different podcast episode. But I think it is also important to name that during this time, while I was in this zone of being in my own juice, being in my own confidence, really filled with self-love, maybe for the first time in my life, it is no coincidence that I attracted my partner, who I've now been with for 6 years. And that really kicked off my journey of learning how to welcome in a safe and sexy love. He is someone that I knew for a long time, and there have been two times in my life that I have met a man, and especially a man my age, a boy, and felt like in my bones as soon as I met that person, like, oh, you're a good person. You were a good man. And I remember feeling that way when I first met my partner, which I had known him for 6 years before because he was friends with a mutual friend. And I remember never being interested in him because I was attracted to bad boys and toxicity and all my patterns. And it wasn't until I did this healing, was in my pleasure, that our mutual friend was finally like, hey, what about this guy, Kellen? And I was like, what? Oh my God. Anyways, we happened to be finally single after us both being in long-term relationships at the same time. And we fell in love. And so I've also been on a 6-year journey of learning how to be in safe love. And that has been one of the most beautiful privileges of my life, one of the biggest gifts of my life. And so, yeah, during that time, I was also simultaneously entering into my current most serious, safe, and beautiful love. And so it was interesting to be creating a relationship while being in my coach training, because, again, just taking really radical self responsibility, I was also in this space where I was so deep in my own awakening that I was committed to whoever comes with me and whoever is in my life is going to be on this journey with me. And so a lot of our relationship has been crafted from that creativity that came from the personal work that I was doing, and it's been just yeah, the most beautiful thing ever. So anyways, then I when I finished my coach training, this was the beginning of 2019 or mid 2019, I quit my job and I started my business. And holy shit, that has been a whole nother ride. But really, it has been the biggest joy of my life, has been the biggest pleasure of my life. I started just really helping women fall in love with their bodies, fall in love with their sexuality, and just had the hugest privilege of getting to spread this work. And I would say that the beginning of starting my business was just so much creativity, so much risk, so much like exploration and trying new things, and so much growth. And it was it's just it was just really beautiful. A couple years ago, I would say maybe like 3 or 4 years into my entrepreneurship journey, and my coaching journey, which I guess that is another thing to name. So with my coaching journey started my entrepreneurship journey. And with that brought this whole other aspect of growth of, wow, I don't just have to learn how to be a really great coach and practitioner, but I also have to learn now how to run my own business. And that actually then required me to really step into trusting in my voice in the world, trusting that I had something to offer, being seen, reconnecting with my creativity, reconnecting with writing and, my gifts, and this journey of really having to own my gifts and love my gifts and share them with the world. And that is obviously a continued journey. But yeah, just kicked off so much growth, so much growth there. And a few years into my entrepreneurial journey, I hit burnout. Running your own business requires a lot. And maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, I had my first experience with experiencing burnout and clinical depression. And that has been like a major pivotal growth point for me too. And so where you find me today is actually coming out of a period of a long depression, a time where I felt like I was losing myself, but of course, as a lot of transformational portals are, was an experience of finding myself. I will probably record a whole nother podcast episode about that. But it's also really just made me grow as a teacher and as a practitioner. And I am coming through on the other side, feeling what I would say a new depth in my work. A deepening of my work. So I think in the beginning of my work, I was very much like pleasure, 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 self pleasure. Oh my gosh, I'm a young maiden. I'm in my spring. I'm in my summer. I'm in my sexual awakening. I would also say I was in like my honeymoon phase with all of my own work and with all of these ideas. And now I feel like, almost like being in a I see life as being in a relationship with everything. So I'd say in my relationship with my work, it was almost like, oh shit, like shit got real. Like when you're in the honeymoon phase of a relationship and then all of a sudden shit gets real and you're like, oh, this is like the healing part. This is when we're figuring out kind of like the hard stuff. I would say that's what these past 2 years have been, both with myself, with my work. Um, but and now I'm on the other side of that, which I think after that honeymoon phase and after that, like, holy shit, we're figuring it out phase, is like this deep devotional commitment phase. And I am in that right now. I'm actually just in my deep devotional era in general, deep devotional commitment to loving myself, deep devotional commitment to my community, to my values, to my teaching, to my work, to life. And so that is very much kind of the center and the frame of where my work is now. I would say that more than anything, I am a teacher of love, love in all its forms, self love, spiritual love, physical love, intimate love, love of our gifts, love of one another, relationship love. And that is what this podcast is going to be all about. I think I'm going to record another podcast episode that's really like my current perspective and my purview. But this feels like a good place to land for today. That was a lot. Wow. Thank you for actually, I really deeply want to thank you for sitting and witnessing and listening to my story. I hope that it served you in some way. I hope that this helps you get to know me. It did end up being really more of my journey with my sexuality and pleasure and love, and I'm good with that. And I guess what I want to leave you with today is just to know that we are stories and novels and works in progress our entire lives. I think if there's anything that I've learned from all of these different chapters is finally surrendering to the fact that um, growth and healing and learning will be a never ending journey. Um, I am in this current chapter of my life, and now I know that there will be many, many more chapters that will come, many more chapters of growth, and many more chapters of having to integrate and learn hard lessons. And so I know that a lot of my clients come to me in this pursuit of healing. And one of the things that one of my current clients has really reflected to me that she's learned through our work together is there is no magic pill, there is no sort of one stop shop, but my invitation to her, the lesson that she reflected that she's learned and that I want you to walk away with is to just really love the journey, to know that you are always going to be a work in progress, as my friend Joe Portia says, a woman in progress. And I'm here to be in progress with you. I'm here to be in progress out loud. This is my devotion to you and to share with you anything that I might find that is helpful along the journey. And maybe an invitation for you to go back, and if you could tell the story of your own sexuality, your own relationship with love, both the beautiful imprints and the difficulty, as a way of just honoring and seeing this complex relationship that you have as a way to understand yourself more. Actually, a lot of my clients come to me and they tell me their stories. And so I also want to say thank you to every person who's come into my world and has told me your story. Here is my telling of my story, um, to be in deeper relationship with you. But so many of my clients come to me and they tell me their stories and they really say to me, like, wow, I've never said this out loud. I've never allowed myself to think about this all out loud. And I think it's so healing and so beautiful to let yourself own and know and center and dignify the story that you've been living, because that is often the starting point for the story that we want to continue to write. So that would be my invitation to you. I always want to leave you with a nugget of something that you can take away. And I can't wait to continue to explore the journey of life and this podcast with you. Thank you for listening. I think I'm supposed to say things like and subscribe and leave a review. Please do if you feel called. And I will see you in the next episode.